I don't know. I just really got into the Byzantine Empire recently over the last couple of months, but because I've had spare time, I've read a lot about it. You know what else I found out as well? A lot of the people that I admire the most, and I'm not saying their names on air for obvious reasons, but they're all obsessed with it. I had no idea why. These are, prominent key men, folks.
I tell you why. It's very obvious.
Why?
Because it represents a very clear example of how the barbaric Muslim society took over this exceptional artistic civilization that we had created. And that fits their narrative really well.
Are they wrong, though?
Look, if you only read Byzantine sources, you're going to hate the Muslims. But like, if you read the other sources too, I'm not saying you're going to switch sides, but you might have a more sort of robust and nuanced understanding.
Well, this is my understanding of it, and this will really get Miss Love's engine purring, right? The Byzantine Empire acted as a shield to keep those muzzies out of Europe for hundreds of years. What I understand...
Wait, but... I'm so afraid of this segment, but anyways, continue.
No, because this is the thing that I understand from reading it now. When Sam Harris talks about it in the modern context that you don't understand how extremist Muslim doctrine is, it's not like the other monotheistic religions. I don't really care, because as soon as you start putting out monotheistic, Jesus this, Muhammad that, I usually switch off. What I understand from the Byzantines is that they were an empire that was strategically placed in a hard-to-defend region, very, very hard to defend. The city was exceptionally well-positioned to defend, but the empire itself, you were attacked from all angles. And so what they came up with was revolutionary diplomacy for the time, and they were able to keep away all of their enemies by bribing these ones, making these ones fight with each other, keeping marriage ties between these ones. Their army, futuristic for the time. Exceptional, because as in the Roman tradition, just picked the best of everything. And that was how they were able to reinvade Europe, because they just used kind of Hunnish tactics on the barbarians there and kept it and whatever. And so they were able to do it with minimal forces. Very impressive civilization. Very impressive. I'm more impressed by them than the Romans, which is a big thing for me. They are the Romans, but, the Romans.
Well, they survived for a lot longer, so that means that they were probably a lot more resilient.
A lot more resilient. Which is more of a shame as to why I'm just so dirty about 1453. And when I told my lawyer about it, he sent me back this book, and he was saying, read this so you maintain the rage. I think a lot of the intellectuals that I know in my life really resent the fact they're still dirty about Constantinople falling, and so am I. Actually, there's a couple of moments in history that make me cry. Reading about the fall of Constantinople makes me cry.
Well, of course, because it was like the jewel that was taken away from them. So it's obviously you're gonna be salty about that. But just on like Sam Harris's point on, you don't understand like how fundamentalist Islam is, and you can like probably read it from the text on preceding to the fall of Constantinople. But this is what I want to add. All political conquests of the time, whether it be Islamic, Zoroastrian before that, or Christian, or whatever it may be, it was all guised in religious tenets. Because that's the only way. How the fuck do you motivate like a bunch of people to go and attack this place where you might lose and you're definitely going to suffer a lot, if not by religion? You tell them like God wants you to do it. And the example is, that's how the Byzantine also defended themselves, right? By their same religion. The whole Crusades is an example of motivating people based on religion to attack. It's all just like two power groups fighting against each other.
But this is the thing. This is the difference. Islam was a new breed, and it was impressive because it got all of these tribes in the Middle East to come together and become a real threat to Europe. That was impressive. The trade-off of it was every other civilization that came before it that was an existential threat to the Byzantine Empire. So we're talking about the Huns, whatever form the Persians took at the time. As you were saying, it was a political move. But this was truly a fundamentalist move. The real clinch pin here was that you couldn't negotiate with them. They would not accept peace treaties, ever. they would always say, "You're non-believers. It is our duty from God to convert or destroy you." That's it. That was the end of negotiations.
Well, look, part of it is true in the sense that, again, this is my opinion, obviously, but part of it is true in the sense that in certain situations, they were saying stuff like that, where we destroy you or we conquer you. But the defense is, that's how every conqueror ever does it. Like, do you think the Mongols were different or the Han were different? The only difference between Han and
you pay them off with gold.
Well, the difference was, in this area, so Han or the Persian Empire they were independent empires that were far from Constantinople. So they usually met at peripheries where they'd be trying to conquer as much as possible, and somewhere in the middle they would meet and they would fight, or maybe if there's a stalemate, they would come up with a peace agreement. The Muslim empire started from an area that was not famous for having empires. It was like a dead zone. It was like south of Middle East and Saudi Arabia. Like, it's equivalent to like a big sort of a political force emerging from, I don't know, like Dubbo or some shit, as opposed to Melbourne or Sydney. So it's bizarre. But like...
Yes. And I am impressed by that. I do need to get that on the record.
But so when they are trying to exert their influence, their domain is Constantinople. And the fact that like a lot of... This is also from my understanding and from what I've read, like the whole idea that Islam spread by the sword. It's true in certain areas and in many areas, but in most areas that's not true. Actually, most of the time they discouraged converting to Islam because that meant lower taxes. Actually, that's why one of the bigger sections of Muslims is Shia Muslims, because they offered Islam without discouragement. And because they were an obscure minority initially, they didn't really care about political power or anything. But in certain areas, you're right, it was by sword and conquest and they converted, but that is a minority from what my understanding is. And Constantinople became Muslim. Like the area, because it was the peripheries of Constantinople, it was almost like a colony because they were controlling areas that were actually very culturally different from them. Constantinople was more culturally similar to Western Northern Europe as opposed to what modern day Turkey is.
Well, the reason that it was able to survive after the sack of the Fourth Crusade was because they were Greek. So they did have that ethnic clinch hold because it was Greece.
Yeah, and there was an absence of a powerful ideology within the Middle East which emerged after the Muslims started taking over.
Yeah.
So there was not a lot of competition to fight. But when there was a competition, that's the other thing. Like the Byzantine Empire clearly was in a decline, and the Islamic Empire was clearly on an upward trajectory, which switched around the First World War when the Ottomans were on a downward trajectory and Western European civilization was on an upward trajectory.
Yeah, but it's just so sad because there was just a couple of decisions that if the Byzantine emperor of the day just kept them. One of them was that on the frontiers before that, they kind of left the frontier cities tax-free, which encouraged people to stay there, which meant that they were heavily fortified. If they kept that policy going, probably would have survived till today. If there was just even a couple of thousand more men on the walls in 1453, they probably would have survived. There's a couple of things, a couple of key moments where you thought, fuck, if only they stuck around. But I think the main thing that makes me dirty about it, and I think this is the clash of civilizations, that is exactly what you were learning in school of like, let me tell you about the greatest man who ever existed, Mehmed II, right? And we just learned the exact opposite. I'm just really sad that if Constantinople stuck around, even as a city-state, for maybe 50, 100 more years, the Roman Empire, in some form or another, would have stuck around to the point that instead of it being Istanbul today, it would still be Constantinople, and you would have that sort of uninterrupted legacy from the Roman Empire. And obviously it changed a lot over the centuries, but it could still claim legacy to that. And now when you go there and you look at the Hagia Sophia, it's just like, it's got these fucking stupid poles over the front of it that fucked it up. You go there, the whole city is just constantly getting redeveloped because the prime minister there is a cunt and doesn't give a fuck about any of it. And so it's like, that piece of Rome is gone.
That is true, but from like the other side's perspective, they were considered improvements. It's really your point of view. Like, one point of view is that the tragedy of Constantinople, and the other point of view is the amazing victory of the creation of Istanbul.
But it wasn't that amazing. He had 80,000 men and cannons. It's not that incredible. He should have been able to take it a lot easier.
Actually, and you know what? This is what I've also noticed, and this is not necessarily a part of Constantinople, or it's just a thing of history. The more amazing you are, let's say the more into art you are, the more into intellectual pursuits you are, the richer your civilization is, the worse you are at war. And the better you are at war, the worse you are at all of this other stuff. So basically, if you look at like when when Muslims conquered Spain and were trying to get into France, the French were actually pretty heroic in that way. They stopped their march over there. But because when the Muslims eventually understood that they weren't able to cross into France, and they've reached their limit in Spain, and they still became less warlike, it actually ushered in a great era of real intellectual discoveries. Like the modern disciplines of chemistry and all of that stuff was created at the time. But what it also meant was that they became less warlike, and then the French eventually took back to Spain and expelled them, and also the Jews for some reason. Comes with the package. And so I feel like a lot of those early Muslim conquests, it was new. They were really focused on conquering, and they became better they were more warlike than what the Byzantine had. The Byzantine had become more like intellectual and artistic in some way.
Which is the other tragedy. I know that everyone always says, yeah, it spurred on the Renaissance and that's all well and good, but the Renaissance was in the Byzantine Empire. That's what I found really interesting about learning about it, because I always just stopped after the West Roman Empire, just didn't care about it. But man, they really kept intellectualism alive throughout the Middle Ages. It wasn't coming from anywhere else. It was just there.
But okay, how about this? What if I make this argument? The fact that you and me live in the first world, enjoy a really high standard of living, as opposed to starving in, I don't know, some third world country, is because of the Muslims stopping the shipping supplies to Asia. Because if that hadn't been done, then the British would not have the incentive, or for that matter, the Western European colonial powers would not have the incentive to conquer the sea. And if they hadn't conquered the sea, there would have been no colonization. And if there wasn't no colonization, there wouldn't have been the industrialization. So thank them.
But don't you think that would have happened anyway? Because if it wasn't the Muslims stopping it, it would have been the Byzantines stopping it.
Well, so don't you think if those few decisions that you're talking about were made, it still would have been the same?
No, I think that if those few decisions were made, the Byzantine Empire would have become even more irrelevant than what it was, but you'd still have that cool relic. That's all I'm sad about, really, is just the fact that you go there and you look at the churches there and you're like, those poles fucked it. It looks uglier now. That's all I care.
Look, I understand it from your perspective, because the other perspective which we weren't taught is that Constantinople wasn't just a Christian town. It was the Christian town. And the fact, usually when you lose a war, you lose peripheries and areas that you technically shouldn't really be there. Or if you were there, it's barely at the margins. But this was like the heart and center, the soul. And to figure out that it's been taken over by the enemy is a tough pill to swallow, so I get it.
Yeah, look, and also the other thing is I'm also deeply disappointed with the Catholic Church.
Why are you disappointed with them?
Because they just didn't care about it, because it was Coptic Christian or Orthodox or whatever, right? And there was a massive schism, and they almost hated each other more than the Muslims. They might have even hated each other more than the Muslims. And it was only when Constantine XI switched over to Catholicism, which was a huge sin. There was actually a big saying back then that it was better to have the Muslim crescent than it was to have the Catholic cross. That was a big viewpoint in Constantinople at the time.
Because the infighting was that insane.
The infighting was that insane. But I think that was a big point of why it fell as well. Is the fact that just that form of Christianity just lost out. They didn't care about it anymore.
Well, I think there's your answer. Like, on one hand, you had the Byzantine Empire where the schisms or the divisions were intensifying. And on the other hand, you had this brand new ideology which seems to be uniting all these tribes that hated each other. And the historical trajectory was such that it had to happen.
50 more years, man. That's all I'm asking.
But look at it now. You've got the Middle East, the same places that were unifying, dividing and killing each other, where the West is pretty unified. I mean, like we almost live in our news headings of the day, but let's be real. The West is a lot more unified than like the Middle East at the moment.
Yeah.
So,
but that's what I'm saying. The Byzantine Empire was doing what the US does now, which is just making all these little infights in their neighbors to preserve that empire. And they kind of some emperors just sort of stopped that and thought, why are we paying gold to this? Oh, no, we're getting invaded. That's why. Shit. Yeah, we'll do it again.
Yeah. Well, I suppose you're right. Like the fact that you can't bribe someone means that whatever ideology they're following is really strong for them to resist it.
That's what really scared me. It reminded me of that Terminator quote. That is the scariest line in the entire Terminator franchise, when John Connor sits her down and says, you just don't understand these robots. You can't bargain with them. You can't reason with them. All they do is find a target and kill. And I was like, fuck, they are. They are Terminators of the Middle East.
Well, they would have definitely seemed like Terminators to people in Constantinople. I can't disagree with that.
But it's really interesting hearing that it's the exact opposite viewpoint, and that's what you learned in school.
Yeah, no.
Then again, we just didn't learn about it, which is another thing that I'm pissed off about.
Well, to be fair, we didn't learn about it heaps too, but obviously our sympathies were with the side that was taking over. Like we considered a huge victory. Obviously, I mean. Dude, I told you about this.
Satisfied with their entire empire.
Dude, it
wasn't even a good place by then. It sucked.
Because my dad is an old school commie. This is what tells you about like different perspectives. We always learned the Vietnam War as we always called it the Vietnam War. We always called it a debacle of the U.S. Government trying to. My dad called the Vietnam War the War of Independence, and I was like, Dad, what war are you talking about? What War of Independence? He's like, oh no. The one that ended in 1975. I was like, oh,
bang on.
Of course.
Yeah.
From their perspective, that's War of Independence.
Yeah.
From our perspective, it was like a blunder or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyways, it's all about like different perspectives. But I understand the perspective.
What does your dad think about it? Have you ever asked him?
No, he'd be very pro. He'd be very happy
that Mehmed took over.
Yeah, that Mehmed took over. And we've got these stories, like the stories of Saladin taking over modern day Israel, and how that was like, we're told that it's like it was a good conquest because he forgave and he gave passages back. So there's always these myths that are created to suit your narrative, just like the Byzantine narrative. There's things created like things like, if these few things were done, it would have been A-okay and we would have still been living in Constantinople. Like, maybe, but probably not.
Maybe. Yeah, you're right. What did Twitch think about it?
People are saying Saladin, hot. Yeah, because Saladin is one of those figures that even the Western world has accepted as he's all right. Yell out, dude, make Ali laugh. What? I don't know what they're saying, but Miss Love, are you still alive?
Yes.
I think he's watching Don't Look Up right now. But okay, let's...
And ironically, he's not looking up.